Today I'm going to show you how to go about making a spare key for a simple padlock like the one we just made. You may have lost a key, or you found a lock in an antique shop and you never had a key and you want to be able to use it. So this is the steps you would follow to go about making a key for that lock. The first thing I would do is turn the lock over and look at the back. Now the rivet heads are pretty obvious here because I haven't cleaned up the back of this lock yet, but even still, any lock will have visible rivets that show how the parts were assembled that made up the lock. Now if you line up the keyhole with the back of the lock, the first thing you'll figure out is that the main rivet in the center is for the pivot pin. And next to that you have two small angled rivets, and so obviously those are some kind of a ward that the key has to work around. This rivet may be a little puzzling. If you remember, this is where I had to repair a hole that was drilled in the wrong place, but it won't take you too long to figure out that that doesn't really have anything to do with the lock. At the top of the lock there's two sets of rivets that are parallel to each other, so those are obviously some kind of bolt guides. And that small rivet just above the bolt guides is for a tumbler. We don't know the design of it yet, but we know that there's some kind of a tumbler that the key is going to have to move the bolt off to one side. So even though we don't specifically know what's inside, the pattern of rivets on the back of the lock do follow a pretty familiar pattern, so it starts to suggest what you are going to encounter. The next step is to take a simple bent piece of wire and to feel around inside the lock. The purpose of this is to try to get an idea of what's actually inside the lock. We know there's a ward there, but we still don't know exactly what it looks like. So by poking around, you can sort of paint a picture of what is actually an obstacle and where the clear spaces are. If you're working with a lock that you're not familiar with, there may be wards that have been riveted to the cover plate as well as the back plate. These rivets may not be too visible because they usually try to keep the cover plate a lot cleaner than the back plate. The next thing you need to do is to prepare a key blank that fits inside the keyhole and rotates as far as it can from left to right. And now I'm finally ready to transfer the location of the wards inside the lock to the key. And this is actually part of the process I was dying to try. I've read about this and I've heard about it, but I've never had a chance to do it myself. I'm going to be using a candle flame to cover the key bit with soot. By holding the key in the flame, I'm preventing it from burning efficiently, so that's creating the soot that's going to coat the key bit. When the end of the key is totally black, you're ready to insert it in the lock and see where the marks show up. The soot comes off of this key very easily, so be really careful when you insert the key into the lock so it doesn't drag onto the side of the keyhole and create marks that are confusing. And then once it's inside the lock, you just rotate it from side to side until it bumps up against something. Now that round dot is where the key bumped up against that circular detail that I put on the one edge of the ward, and the straight line is where the key bumped up against the square cut end of the wards. So the first thing I'm going to do is make a simple saw cut that follows that line that's scribed on the key, because I don't know whether the ward is actually to the left or right of that line. So for now I'm just getting rid of that line, because I know that that's bumping up against something. And then I'll put the key back in the flame, repeat the process, and see what else shows up. Here you can start to see the rest of the ward starting to show up. And on the other side of the key, you can start to see how the ward is not just simply a flat piece of steel bent in a circle. And from here on in, you're really just repeating this process over and over again. You coat the key with soot, try it in the lock, see what marks show up, and then remove that material either by filing or chiseling, whatever seems to be appropriate for that situation. It's really important to just remove the marks that you see, especially if you're working with a lock that you're not familiar with. Now, we just finished building this lock, so you know what's inside, so you really just need a few indicators to get you going in the right direction. But if you don't know where the wards are and how they're shaped, you really have no choice but to just, make a mark, remove that material, try it again, see how that progresses. So I'm a little further along in the process at this point. Once it became evident that I was dealing with a circular detail on that ward, I went ahead and drilled out the material. And I chose a drill that was just going to be large enough to fit the smallest needle file that I had. And then from here it's just the same process again. I coat the end of the key with soot and I try it in the lock, and then I just remove enough material to get rid of the marks until I can get the key to fit around that ward plate. Here I'm a little further along again. The key is fitting in the lock, it turns, but it's jamming up somewhere, and I see with the soot that it's actually the barrel of the key is not round and it's jamming up against the side of the keyhole. So I'll just take a few minutes to get rid of those high spots, and then I'll repeat this process to make sure that the key turns all the way around the lock without jamming up against anything. I would say this whole process took about an hour, and I now have a working key for this lock. Now, I mentioned in the first video of this padlock series that this basic mechanism had been used in locks for several hundred years, and here's an example of a modern version of this mechanism. And if you ever lived in a house that was built before the 1950s, you're very familiar with this type of lock. The parts have been modernized, of course, but when you start examining it, you'll see that it's exactly the same mechanism that I used in this padlock. Now, this particular lock has a couple of added features that weren't available on most of the common door locks, but the main locking mechanism is still identical. There is a bolt that moves from side to side, and the tumbler in this case locks into a pin that's sticking out the side of the bolt. There are two types of wards in this lock. The first are these two little pegs that are cast into the surface of the cover plate. And the second ward is in the design of the tumbler itself. You can see the scribe lines that the key is made on the tumbler, so the key needs to have a split in it so it can go on either side of this tumbler, and the notch has to be the right length so it lifts the tumbler just the right amount to allow the bolt to slide over to the side. So making a key for this lock is a lot more straightforward because you can open it up and take whatever measurements you need directly from the inside of the lock. So like we did with the padlock, the first thing is to make a key blank that fits into the keyhole. From there you need to cut notches on the side of the key bit to fit around the wards that are cast into the cover plate. Now the wards are only on one side, but don't forget the key needs to work the lock from both directions, so you need to cut this notch on both sides of the key bit. From there, it's a simple matter of measuring the radius that you need from the center of the pivot point to make sure that the notch of the key falls in the right spot, and as well measuring the exact location of where the key needs to fit around that tumbler. Of course, testing the key is very simple because you can work with the lock opened up and see exactly what's going on. Hi, I'm Dennis, and thanks for watching. If you're interested in supporting this channel, the simplest way, of course, is to like, comment, and subscribe. If you have questions and you want to contact me directly, you can do so by emailing me at either one of the addresses that I have listed here. It may take me a couple of days, but I will get back to you. Of course, financial support is always welcome. The only product that I produce is the information contained in these free videos. So if you like the work that I'm doing and the videos that I'm putting out, and you can spare a couple of dollars a month, consider becoming a patron by clicking the orange Patreon logo at the bottom of the screen. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.